Uh, Thank you. I, I don't know if this is working. It is? Okay, great. I know this is the last presentation of the day, and I'm not going to take a very long time for that reason, because you will hate me. So I'm going to start with a very simple question. Not a simple question, a simple idea. Is if we look at the history of humankind, if you will, we've been trying to understand and explain the world. So if your mother-in-law was swept away by like a flood or something, you might act trying to find out why that happened. If your cattle was killed in some lightning strike, you might try to understand why that happened. And the way we've done it is we've tried to sort of rely on shamans and priests who would explain to us that there was a deity or there was something of that sort. And this is how we sort of plodded our way and survived as a species. And after a while, we figured out that there were smarter ways of doing things. Till about the turn of the previous century, we figured that these shamans and priests are not very good ways of organizing society. Maybe we could be a bit more scientific. And the rationalization of society was born. There's a guy called Max Weber in 1918, and just at the 1917 in Munich, at the turn of just as the Second World War the First World War was being lost by Germany, who came up with this idea that we, in fact, we engage in rationalism. We don't look at the world as if it was enchanted, because before we had science, the world was a place full of magic. There were magical reasons for why things happened, but with the advent of science, we could figure out why things happened. The world became disenchanted. And with that came this idea of organizing society in a scientific way. And for that, we needed data. And that's what governments did. That's what kingdoms did, actually. They gathered data about people, and they tried to classify and come up with rules to govern society. That's all. It's pretty much the birth of modern bureaucracy. And this, he said, would lead to a disenchanted world where the bureaucracy would act like an iron cage. Now, if you think that bureaucracies are unobtrusive, I would request you to turn your mind back to COVID. I was living in the Netherlands. I remember we had very strict rules about which was decided by the bureaucracy about what you could do. I remember being followed by a drone at 10 p.m. at night because I was 4 minutes late to walk into my house, and the thing was hovering there, and I was like, yes, I'm going in. But that's how, if you think bureaucracy is something in the background, no, there is an iron cage. You can be trapped in your house by the decisions that are made by it. Right? We don't really think through what happens when you start digitizing this. Right? Once our information is all present in this digital infrastructure, which now becomes a substrate for making decisions about how we live, it can have massive implications for us. In Netherlands, there was a very famous case called the Dutch childcare scandal case. And what they did was they had a tremendous amount of data, and they tried to predict who was likely committing fraud. It so happened that many of the people who were suspected of committing fraud happened to be of foreign origin or have not very Dutch names. So their name was not Van Helk, but it was something else. And the government decided that this was good enough for them to act on it, and so they asked them to pay back childcare benefits. What happened? They were not very rich people. They didn't have enough money, and they fell below the threshold where you could support a child. So the government then said, wait, you don't have money. We're going to take your children away. So they removed children from families, only to find out a few years later that the algorithm was making predictions that were flawed. These people, after they were investigated, were found not to have committed fraud. And they're currently being sued. The Dutch government, it was Rutte, who is now, I think, the head of NATO, had to step down, only to be promptly re-elected again, which is always fun. The UK, that this should make you really happy. Anyone seen the movie Minority Report? That's a real thing. We are doing it. So the UK government has tied up with the police in Manchester, and it's scooped up all this data. And what it's doing is it's trying to predict when you or I, or whoever lives in Manchester apparently, might commit a capital crime. And when someone using the Freedom of Information Act, asked them, hey, what on earth are you doing? And in a typically Orwellian fashion, they responded, we're making society safer. I don't feel safe. But that's not the point. The point is that they're actually using this information that's present in our digital infrastructures as a substrate to do all sorts of things without us actually understanding the full implications of what this is. Imagine being So then what's the next step? Pre-crime? So you get arrested before you commit a crime? And then what's the counterfactual? How do you know if someone would have acted on it? The problem also becomes is that there's a lot of multiple jurisdictions involved in this. And once you start thinking of the idea, and I asked this question earlier, where if your data is in India, or you're an Indian citizen, or a citizen of wherever you might be, but your data is being held somewhere else in a different jurisdiction in the US, what do? What if your data is misused? We have this scenario where we are living, our digital footprints are in a cloud without any clear jurisdiction of who owns what and who is responsible for what. And we all live in the context of a state, and a state that can do a tremendous amount of harm. There are massive power asymmetries involved. We cannot opt out of government services, right? We are not given a choice as residents and citizens of these countries. But the government has a monopoly on violence, and it can tell you what you can do and can't do. It can decide whether you should be allowed to get benefits, access the NHS services, et cetera. How do we figure this out? So one of the things which I've conceptualized is this idea which is rooted in pragmatism, which is the idea of like the meaning of things is based on the effect it has on the world. And in this case, this sort of advancements can have massive harms to us, right? So it can cause harm. But I go further than that. I don't think it's about harm, just harm. It's about, can the harm be reversed? So if Ocado doesn't deliver your stuff on time, it's not a big harm. Right? If you're denied a minor service for some time and you try and get your driving license renewed, and good Lord, sometimes they screw it up, fixing that is not a big problem. The cost of the reversal of harm is not very high. But if you get tossed in jail, then that's a massive harm that's done to you. And the cost of reversing that is almost impossible. That harm is not reversible. So the idea is that the stronger or the higher the cost of reversing the harm, the more irreversible it is, the stronger the safeguards that have to be. Right? And then you have to sort of codify that using like 4 basic principles, and accountability is obviously one of them. So you have to have a human in the loop. You should not be having an automated system that decides your future or what happens to you. Right? Another thing is appropriate safeguards have to be present. What happens, or what can you make sure to prevent this sort of harm happens? And again, the degree of safeguards would depend on to what extent can it cause harm, and is it reversible? Permit the right to sue. I mean, Americans love to sue, but I think in this case they might be right. If you're harmed by this sort of imposition on you, you should have the right to sue. And I do believe that jury should then give damages just to make sure that the cost of someone getting this wrong is really high. And finally, you have to have traceability. Right? With this multiple jurisdictions, we have to figure out some way how to make it traceable. Who owns the data? Who's selling it? Who misused it? How do you do that? Well, we need an organization. Now, if you've ever flown abroad, especially to slightly countries which tend to be less advanced or called the global south or whatever, the reason why those flights are pretty smooth and you don't worry about them too much is because there's an agency called the ICAO, and the ICAO is basically an international civil aviation organization which has harmonized standards across the world. And it scores different countries, but it makes sure that they maintain a certain minimum threshold. And then what countries do, they say, hey, you are not meeting the minimum threshold, so maybe we're not flying into you. Or at least that's what airlines do. And this sort of an agency can be established so that it becomes a central repository for standards, for traceability, et cetera. And then countries or other organizations who sign into it can interact and do trade with each other much easily. And the ones who don't have a higher cost. And essentially, that's the idea, that we have to have some centralized agency that harmonizes these standards, where actually there's an incentive for people to take part, and it's difficult for them to not take part in it. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for your time.